Hi everyone, welcome to Off the Podium. I have a special guest, Yale University professor, Dr. Martin Bresnick. Welcome to Off the Podium.
Thanks. It's nice to be here, Tigran.
That was a perfect pronunciation of my name. Have you heard my name before somewhere?
No, but am I correct in assuming that you are of Armenian descent?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and I have many Armenian friends, and so I'm used to some names that are not so common. I had a very good friend named Serpui, and that's not that's not a very common American name.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
There you
That's
go.
true. And I'm always fascinated with last names, and I'm gonna take kind of a wild guess, but your last name is it Eastern European?
Yes, that's right. It's actually it's an interesting name because the first part of it, Brez or Breza, is a South Slavic word for birch tree.
Uh-huh.
And so the name turns out to be fairly, it's not that unusual in Eastern Europe, in the Slavic lands. Not so, it changes. There are variants of it from all the way from the south in Bulgaria,
Yeah.
where you find actually a little town named Bresnick, all the way up to Lithuania and Russia, where the pronunciation changes and switches. But
Yeah.
it's a pretty ordinary name in that part of the world.
Wow. And reading about you, trying to get some information so I could ask you some questions, I was very surprised to see. Well, not surprised, but you studied with some renowned composers. Do you want to talk about
Yes.
some of the influences in your career, or maybe just some of the stories or studies, your time with some of those people? And I won't say any of the names. I'll let you say some of those names.
Well, I mean the important names I have often pointed to two particular composers as my most profound influences. One, the American composer John Chowning, who I worked with very closely at Stanford University, and who was a great pioneer in the field of computer music and had made some very, very important contributions to the field of computer music. And I was very fortunate to have found myself a student of his and a younger colleague at a time when he was just beginning to show the power of these digital controlled instruments to make beautiful and interesting sounds and move them around in space. And it was a real privilege and an honor to be at Stanford at the time as these great breakthroughs were being made, and also to be in the presence of such a generous and non-ideological figure as John Chowning. He was supportive, and he was ready to support many different kinds of approaches to making music. So that's great. And the other one is also perhaps much better known, was George Ligeti,
Yeah, of course.
who I had introduced to his music by Chowning, actually, who showed me a score. I had never heard of Ligeti or seen any of the music, and one day John got a copy of Atmospheres.
Mm-hmm.
This was in the fall or early spring of 1968, and when I saw that music, I thought, wow, that is really incredible. And I made up my mind somehow I would study with Ligeti. And the story of how I came to study with him is a long story, but to make it shorter, it ends up eventually that, despite the fact that I got a Fulbright to study with him in Vienna, where he was living in 1969, I didn't actually get to work with him until 1972 at Stanford, when he was in residence at Stanford University. And in fact, it was the only time that Ligeti had anything like such an extended residency outside of Europe. And I became a kind of personal student, a private student at that time. And, Ligeti signed my doctorate from Stanford, which I consider to be one of the great honors of my life. And I remained in contact with Ligeti as long as he lived, and visited him in Europe, and we kept track of each other. And again, it's a very remarkable composer, as is well known, I think, all around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And also, for some people, like me in particular, he was a very inspiring and supportive teacher.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned electronic music, and I don't think I tried to listen to quite a few of your compositions. You wrote a lot of compositions, but any electronic music compositions or any compositions that kind of incorporated electronic music? I couldn't find. I don't think I saw, or maybe I just didn't search well.
Yeah, there are two. There are probably two most significant ones, and both of them involve computer music.
Mm-hmm.
They are electronic in the sense that the computers make the sounds using the voltage to eventually drive a loudspeaker, but they are digital pieces. And one of them you can actually find, it's a film score called Pour, P-O-U-R,
Okay.
Which I wrote at the very beginning of my work with Chowning at Stanford in 1969. And another one somewhat more recent than that called Lady Neal's Dump, which is a funny title, and it worked for a rack of, it was called the DX7s. They were all in a rack called the DX, I forget now what the model is, but they were 8 modular DX7s in a row controlled by a computer software program that I wrote for the wonderful composer and my old friend Neil Rolnick. And that work is recorded also and is available. One is available, probably you can find on YouTube. The other one is actually one of the early recordings of computer music and is purely computer music. So those are the two. I have written pieces that involve computer sounds, but very often they're very unobtrusive. You probably would not even notice them, and most of them turn out, interestingly enough, to be in film scores that I wrote. So that's my world of computer music and electronic music.
Yeah, and you've composed for film, and somehow there's a separation with some composers between film composers and then academic music, I guess, composers. How have you managed to be in both?
I'm a very lucky person. I mean, it's true also that in a sense I made my own luck. When I was a graduate student at Stanford, I had never written any music for the film, but I thought it would be interesting to try. So I went to the small film program at Stanford, and I put up a little sign, and I said that said sort of "We'll work for food." And I met some very young, enterprising filmmakers at that time, and I wrote a lot of different pieces of music for short little commercials. And then my relationship with the great documentary filmmaker, who was a dear personal friend, Academy Award nominee, won many prizes, is a fantastic film documentarian. That relationship helped me to continue writing film music throughout a good chunk of my career, especially because writing for documentaries, you're working with a different kind of a world than you would if you were working in the purely commercial film music world of Hollywood.
Yeah.
So John, in particular, John Else, he was very eager to let me do just about any kind of music that I wanted to write, and we actually got nominated for an Academy Award for the film The Day After Trinity, J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Atomic Bomb. He won many prizes, and in a sense he took me along as his composer. But then I also worked for some other people, and it's work I never really had to seek out. It's work that came to me, and fortunately I've never had to work on or even wanted to work on a film project that I didn't feel was a good project or a socially responsible project. So that's how I ended up doing it. And the people I work with on the whole have been very sympathetic to a very wide range of possibilities in film music. It's not the conventional film music that one sometimes hears.
Yeah. What does a successful composer do in today's world? What does a young composer have to do to make it in today's world? You've had, I've had a guest prior to you, your student, Christopher Saron, who's made a successful career for himself as a young composer. Is it different from when you were at that age, or what's different now, or what's the same, and what can composers do to really make a living being a composer? It's so tough.
Yeah, it is very difficult. It's always been difficult, and I think it will continue to be difficult. At the same time, I would say that there are many, many more opportunities for young composers now than there were when I was younger, because of a very complicated change in approaches to how young composers are trained and what they are trained to do. For example, there are many, many, many more competitions and open solicitations than when I was a young person. And what's interesting also is there's been a great deal of interest in opera by young composers.
Yeah.
And so many composers now, many of my own students have made their way toward opera as a way of going ahead. Now, that being said, the hardest thing about being a composer, I think, without question, is writing really good music. I mean, that's really hard to do.
Yeah.
Even the most talented people among us, I think, work with tremendous intensity and focus, and are, the ones who come to kind of prominence very often are not a combination of people who are extremely gifted and extremely hardworking and directed.
Mm-hmm.
I would also say that something I've learned after a long career in the business, that people who really want to be famous as composers have a much better chance of becoming famous than people who don't really care about being famous.
Yeah.
It may seem obvious, but to me it wasn't always obvious. I think that some part of me suffered from the illusion that if you just sat around writing great music, you would become well known and respected. But it turns out that probably I was not completely right about that, not at least in the short run in any case.
Yeah.
So that now I understand that if you really want recognition and you want to be a famous composer, you have to really want to do that, and that does achieve some things.
Yeah.
Still, how to make a living in the business, how to survive in that way, that's very, very tough.
Yeah.
And I've had students who've done very well, so I'm very proud of them, and some of them are extremely well known and have made tremendous contributions musically and continue to do so. I mean, the list is very long, and from David Lang and Julie Wolfe and Michael Gordon all the way down to more recently Chris and his colleagues in the Sleeping Giant group to Missy Mazzoli and any number of people who worked with me and have done very well.
Yeah. Orchestras are folding, and I talk about this a lot, and some music organizations are not doing well, and of course there are many others who are doing well. But for people who are not in the music, in the world of music, who are not musicians, who are not, they're not consistent concert goers, and they ask the question, why is music important? Why should we fund music? Why should we go to these concerts where we could listen to all these things online? What would you say to them?
Well, I think I would say two things. I think almost everybody on the planet is musical in some way. And I think the evidence for that is that there isn't any group of humans that doesn't make music anywhere in the world. And I think that the kind of music that I write, it may require perhaps a little bit more focus and attention, and you have to give it perhaps a little bit more time than other kinds of music, but I think perhaps too much can be made of the differences between genres in music, so that some people think, well, the kind of music that I do is so far away from the kind of music, say, that a folk musician would do, or a rock or a jazz musician. And I personally, I think there are different genres, and they all have their constraints, but I think there are many, many, many more similarities between those kinds of music than many people are prepared to acknowledge for various reasons. So if I meet someone who, and it does happen from time to time, people will say to me, I went to a concert and I heard your music, and I don't know anything about music, and I liked it, but I don't understand it.
Yeah.
And I would very frequently say to such a person, gee, I think you actually you understand much more than you think you do, but describing how you understand a piece of music is very difficult because music is not really verbal, and describing music in words is a little bit like, as someone once famously said, dancing to architecture.
Yeah.
I mean, these are forms of a human expression, both very powerful, that is speech and music, but they only overlap in some small parts, and particularly music, way of thinking or appreciating music, it resides in a place that words don't often reach. Mm-hmm. And I guess on the other hand, I would say, for myself, I love music very deeply, and music has been, has meant so much to me in my life and in the way I look at the world, that I can't imagine a world without it for anyone. I will tell you something funny. Once Ligeti said to me, he said, Martin, I'm very unusual among contemporary composers. And I said, well, yes, of course you are very unusual. You're indeed very unusual. He said, no, not in that way. He said, I'm very unusual among contemporary composers because I am a music lover.
Yeah.
And I thought that was very funny.
Yeah, that's funny and important. I was gonna ask, what can we do as artists, as musicians, to make a better environment or make a better place or welcoming place for these people who have no connection with music? So when they do come to a concert, they're energized and they want to come back. What can we do? It seems like we're not doing something right because there are many first-time goers, but they don't return, it seems like.
Well, I think the answer is not I'm not sure there's an answer to your question, Tigran, yeah. And I am certain that whatever answer there might be is actually a very complicated one. Because on the one hand, I think people gather together to make music and hear music. That's a very deep human need, and I think people are going to do that till there's no more people on the planet. Mm-hmm. I think, we see this in the big rock festivals or jazz concerts or even in small things where people sit together and sing or play together. People need that. They need that music. And I think, in a way, we can count on that happening. Mm-hmm. Now, on the other hand, it's true that in the sort of classical music, what's called classical music or concert music, there is a sense that only a certain class of people are really able to get on with that music or really should be allowed to be there for that music. And I think that's probably not good if we make people feel that they're not welcome in that way. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I would say that it is true that certain kinds of social behavior are needed at classical music concerts that is not needed or is different at other concerts. For example, if you ever attended a concert of Balinese music in Bali, mm-hmm. you'll notice that people talk during the performances. They get some food, they walk away, they come back. The music goes on continuously while the shadow puppet play goes on, and people know when the good part is coming, and then they pay a lot of attention and get quiet, but at other parts, they don't. Mm-hmm. So the social convention around that music is not that you might need, for example, to listen attentively to the Schubert C major cello quintet, where if you don't listen attentively and with a kind of focus pretty continuously, you kind of lose the thread of what that great master is trying to do. Mm-hmm. So I think, different social circumstances and the production of music in those social circumstances, they can be off-putting, but in some cases they can also be appropriate in that they allow for certain kinds of behavior that are the best kinds of behavior for that experience.
Yeah.
That's a long and complicated answer, and I
that was great.
I don't have a great answer.
No, that was great. But now something came to mind. Orchestras, classical music organizations, one of which is Classical Revolution. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they do concerts at unconventional venues. So they do concerts at bars and various places that might have that feeling where people are drinking or talking while a classical concert is happening. What are your feelings towards that approach to classical music?
Well, in some cases it's good for me. In some cases it's not good. Let me give you an example. At LPR in New York, there have been many concerts there where people walk back and forth to the bar to get a drink during the concert, or a waiter or some wait person will come to your table and ask you what you like to eat. Now, that can work in some pieces of concert music, but it doesn't work well in others. And you don't want the audience to be fighting with itself, trying to constantly shush people who are making noise in a place where the environment encourages them to make noise, or requires them to make noise. On the other hand, you might know that when I first started at Yale, I formed a new music ensemble which had a funny name called Sheep's Clothing. It's the ensemble that did all night concerts at Yale, and Michael Gordon was around for that, and David Lang, and many other interesting people, Michael Tenzer and Evan Zippor, and they were all around that environment. And we did concerts in many different locations, but we tried to select works that could survive moving from one place to another place, that would not be terribly disturbed by the environment or the kind of circumstance. So I think this is a question that has to be done with great care. I think it has to be done carefully.
Yeah. One question that I've been consistent in asking is the question of equality in the world of music. And in the past, it hasn't been equal in a lot of cases, in a lot of places. Not all places, but in a lot of places. Being involved at Yale, having so many successful composers come to your program, and seeing so many composers from different backgrounds, where do you see it? Is it becoming more equal, or is it equal, or has it been equal for a while, at least from your perspective?
Well, I don't. When you say equal, I really think you're working toward the whole question of gender and whether or not the people who identify as male or female had an equal shot at letting their aesthetic and art, music, or musical expression come to the public's eye and or public's ear. And there's no doubt that we have lived in a sexist world which has privileged some people rather than other people, and this is not a good thing. And I don't think music has benefited by sexual segregation or racial segregation. That's not a good thing. And I think in the long run, just speaking for myself, it's very clear in my work and in what I do that recognizing the contributions of different cultures and approaches has enriched my music tremendously. So I'm one of those persons that wants to act affirmatively in that regard. On the other hand, I would also say that it has been it's been difficult to promote this consistently if the pool of people who are doing that work is not sufficiently robust, if it's too small. For example, over the last, let me give you an example. In the last 5 years, the portion of our students who are male and who are female has consistently approached and sometimes achieved parity between the men and women, but only occasionally. On the other hand, it's also been true that, say, of 180 applicants for a place in the Yale program, we might we might get 25 women out of those 180 applicants, and that is not yet a robust number. So that the ability to select from that group becomes challenging because of, we're not alone in wanting the best people from that group. So Michigan and Princeton and other institutions want these wonderful composers, and sometimes we are not able to get them because we can't give them the money they want.
Yeah.
So sometimes when you look at this from one angle, it looks like, well, there should be more people in our program that represent that position. On the other hand, if you look at another angle, you see how hard it is sometimes to get that kind of choice of person that you're actually looking for.
Yeah.
At the same, but things are changing. Things are certainly much better than they used to be, and I think I can't not imagine any reason why women or men would make any better music one than the other.
Yeah.
They're not really all about that.
Yeah. Well, how...
what's really interesting, Tigran, and this is another thing which I do feel I have to say, is that at most of these institutions and where the training of musicians becomes very significant, especially where higher education is involved, rather than, say, becoming a Delta blues guitar player or something like that, among the hardest things to affirmatively support is getting students who come from working class backgrounds, or students who come from areas where their parents didn't have money or couldn't afford music lessons for them, or where the schools in their community did not provide them with access.
Yeah.
That is a very, very serious problem, and it's not just a question of gender identity that's a problem. It's a problem of how can we make music available in a more vigorous way to a wider population, especially in places where economically there's no support for them.
Yeah.
Speaking for myself, I grew up in pretty much a working class neighborhood of amalgamated clothing workers in the Bronx, and but the support for the arts in my day, even in the public school system in New York, was pretty significant. And my school brought my little public school managed to find a woodwind quintet to come in and play when I was 9 or 10 years old, and I'd never heard anything like that in my life. I was completely blown away and delighted, and sort of made a commitment that somehow music had to be a central part of my life. But I'm certainly aware that many other young people of my kind of background had no chance to do that.
Yeah.
And I would put a plug in here for places like where I went to high school, the High School of Music and Art, which is now called LaGuardia School for Music and the Performing Arts, Music and Art and the Performing Arts. That's a public school where you were selected on the basis of what was understood to be your talent, and you didn't have to have a lot of extra money, and they would help you get an instrument. And this was a fantastic and life-changing opportunity for me, and I'm delighted to say that on that level, I've seen that there are more and more schools like that spread around the country, and I hope that we should all, dig in deep and help support them, because it matters a lot.
Yeah, it matters a lot. Education is very important, and one frustrating thing, at least from my perspective, is seeing all these, at least the conducting side, seeing all these conducting master classes with renowned conductors, and I really want to participate, but putting aside the application fee, some of the fees, the ridiculous charges that they have to participate are just, it's out of my budget, and I can't participate in some of those things. And the crazy thing is that these famous conductors, and I wish I had the opportunity to study with some of them, people who have the money, and of course they have to be talented to a certain extent, but they do apply and they have the money to fly out and pay, a couple of $1,000s for the master class, and also have the money to pay for the hotel, the transportation, all of this. They will end up putting those people's names on their resumes and move their career to a better place than someone who doesn't have the money to do that. So it makes it very difficult for someone who doesn't have the money to put some of those things on their resume, which in turn will give them certain opportunities. Of course, master classes don't give you all the opportunities, but they do, having studied with some of these people, give you, a certain credibility in some cases. So
yeah, I mean, there's no question. There's no question about that. I mean, I think if I could take this one step further, I would say that's why I try not to get into a lot of arguments about things like, getting myself worked up into a froth about differences in musical style and differences of musical approach, even when I have feelings about that. But I think much more important is the general question that you described, which is a question of economic opportunity for all humans, the inadequacy of the system that permits people with the greater resources to move ahead, while those without them remain stuck where they are or fall back even further. These are questions that I'm ready to fight for.
Yeah. Well, it's great to have people like you who are willing to discuss these things, but I have a little bit of a different question. What inspires you? What makes you motivated to, wake up and compose and teach and continue doing this for as many years as you have been doing this?
Yeah, if I actually knew a single answer, I would tell you. There are many things. Sometimes I have this kind of interior vision of a piece of music, which seems very important to me to realize. Some almost purely abstract musical thing I can't completely describe in words. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's because I'm very motivated by another work of art or a story that I heard that stimulates me. Sometimes I feel very polemical in almost a Brechtian sense, like Bertolt Brecht, and I feel like I have to add my voice to the chorus of people who protest some kind of injustice, and I have to do it in music. So, and sometimes all those things come together in a single work. For example, just to give you an idea, I wrote a piece called Caprichos Enfaticos, which is a concerto for the pianist, my wife Lisa Moore, mm-hmm. and the great So Percussion Quartet, which also had was based on the great drawings and etchings of Francisco de Goya. And during the course of the piece, these wonderful Goya drawings appear computerized, and actually by my daughter, computerized by Johanna Bresnick, who's my daughter. Mm-hmm. And Lisa and the percussionists provide music that doesn't necessarily illustrate these pictures, but evokes some of the emotional content around them. And so, in that case, there are numerous musical abstractions involved with the way the composition was made, but there's also a sense of protest, almost a sense of politicization of the musical sphere by doing that. And finally, I think there's kind of story I want to tell. There's a story of human folly and human cruelty and human kindness that I want to just represent as, in some way, as a musical narrative. Yeah. That's not untypical. I also made a theater piece based on Pinocchio called Pine Eyes, based on the great Carlo Collodi Pinocchio, yeah. And another by William Blake called For the Sexes, the Gates of Paradise. Mm-hmm. And most recently, I just finished a big oratorio or passion, a musical passion, which really musically is a descendant of the great St. John Passion of Bach, but it's also based on the teachings and theoretical observations and the life of the English critic Harold Bloom, when Harold is talking about the great poets and authors Walt Whitman, Herman Melville, and Emily Dickinson. So that was just a recent work. So yes, there are numerous things that excite me and get me thinking musically. I would never underestimate, however, no matter what you hear me say about this, the simple desire to tell a story in music in some way, to make music emerge in time, transform itself in time, reveal itself in time, and satisfy its own interior needs over the course of a piece.
Yeah. Well, you wrote some. This is going back to orchestral music. You wrote some orchestral music. You wrote one opera, from what I remember seeing. Where is the future of orchestral music? And I know it's a big question. I know it's a tough question. But having lived through decades of seeing, ups and downs in orchestral music, does it have a future?
Well, if you take the word orchestra in the sense of what it meant when it was originally kind of formed together, which it simply meant a whole bunch of instruments playing together, of course, there's a future for the orchestra. But if you mean the orchestra as conceived by Mahler or by Brahms or by Richard Strauss, or even the orchestra as conceived of by Stockhaus in his some of his larger works, I think that is going to be harder and harder to sustain because its economic base is very difficult to achieve. And that's certainly the case. If you look at the 20th century and you try to figure out what orchestra music in the 20th century has survived, well, there's a few pieces before 1950, very significant ones. And then after that, it gets very thin. If we think of the repertoire since 1950 and what has from 1950 to today, what pieces of music can you count on hearing in a concert situation for orchestra? It's we could discuss it, but there's very, very, very few. And I don't think it's necessarily because the works are not good. I think it's just difficult to get the economics together, and people who are composing recognize that. Also, the orchestra, as it was formed under, I remember Ligeti saying that, he was pointing out something. I had written a piece where there was a very uneven orchestral balance of something, and he was very sensitive to that. And he said, Martin, you ever wonder why, when you look at an orchestra, there's 50 string instruments and all these violins and, perhaps somewhat less violas and cellos and basses, and then, when it comes to the winds, there's only twos or threes, and when it's percussion, ones or twos, or maybe, those were ensembles that were formed based on the actual acoustical needs of the time. Yeah. And the composer's imaginative abilities to meet those needs. But as time changes and as the circumstance change, it seems to me that an orchestra has to change in its understanding of what it is. And let me give you another example of that. And that would be, the composer, the wonderful Dutch composer Louis Andriessen, has written actually very little what you would conceive of as conventional orchestra music. It's because his sensibility and the world that he loves is not really that sound of that kind of 19th century sound. Yeah. Whereas it was perfectly possible, for example, to have somebody like Shostakovich well into the 1960s write convincing orchestra music because his imagination grew out of that sonority and sound. Yeah. You might even extend that perhaps to somebody like Lutoslawski in the great third and fourth symphonies, the cello concerto. These are really pieces where the orchestra is really, beautifully handled and taken account of. On the other hand, my great teacher Ligeti's orchestra music, it's really great, but frankly, I think the piano concerto sounds better in the small orchestration than the big one. That doesn't work as well. And he heard things in beautiful contrapuntal lines, and very often the orchestra, as it was constituted in the 19th century, was not adequate or useful to him. So there's an economic side, and that ties itself together with the imagination of composers. And finally, I've written orchestra music. I just wrote a piece that involves a kind of orchestra, and I wrote a kind of Brechtian piece called "The Way It Goes" for orchestras. It has a orchestra a little bit like a Beethoven concert overture, like Egmont or Coriolanus or something.
I see.
But if you go to many orchestras, and I wouldn't generalize this beyond too far. I wouldn't go too far with this, but very often the musicians in the orchestra are not paid well. They're bored. They don't like the music.
Yeah.
They don't like the conductor.
Yeah.
They don't want to really be there. You can really, as a person, as a human, when I walk into a situation like that, I say to myself, gee, why would I want to have my music among people who don't really want to be there?
That's true.
Wouldn't I rather have my music played by people who are devoted to it, who love it, who will give it the rehearsal and care and love that it needs to speak? So, I think the orchestra is a complicated place, and it's not for everybody, and I think we have to rethink what the concept of a group of instruments playing together is and what it needs to be. Yeah.
Well, that's great. I really wish more people spoke so eloquently and so well about this topic. On a completely different note, if you don't mind sharing some of what you do outside of music, some hobbies, some pastime activities, whatever you might be doing on your off time.
Well, I there's probably the one thing I do more than almost anything else is read. I'm a great reader and lover of literature, so I'm always reading something or rereading something. I try to read something like War and Peace every couple of years, actually, because every time I read War and Peace, or I read Moby Dick, or I read Ulysses, or Portrait of the Artist, or Chekhov short stories, I learn something new about the greatness of those writers and their imagination. Yeah. And I learn something new about human beings, and by learning that, I learn something more about myself. So, poetry, I love it. I read it all the time, and reading is a great hobby of mine. On the other hand, I play tennis.
Wow.
And if I didn't play tennis, I think I would have been dead many years ago, because that's the one thing that'll get me out of my chair to exercise. I'm very fortunate to have a great tennis partner, my wife, and she chases me all over the court. So, yeah, tennis is a great thing that I do.
I'm sure you've read a lot of Chekhov, because your opera was based on some of the literature, right?
That's right. The opera is My Friend's Story is based on a Chekhov short story, but it also manages to smuggle in some other Chekhov material in there, also from a little bit from a short story, Duel, and some other places in Chekhov as well. I'm a great Chekhov fan.
Yeah. Well, did we miss anything that you wanted to talk about? I'm sure
I would only say that in the last couple of years, I've had some absolutely fantastic experiences and performances of my music, and I want to praise those players who have selflessly given themselves to the preparation and the representation of my music, because I tell my students, look, write your pieces as complicated and as difficult as they have to be, but not one rhythm, one note more complicated, because if you leave a little room, players who really are interested in your music will give you so much more than you could have imagined. And for example, the recent performance by Jeff Dauma and the Yale choral artists and the orchestra that was assembled, these wonderful singers and performers, they didn't leave anything in the dressing room, and that piece is an hour and a quarter, and they were alive with music from the beginning to the end, and that kind of experience has been terrific. When Ellie Toyota, a wonderful young violinist who has graduated from Yale, played my Bird as Prophet piece with Lisa Moore recently, it was just amazing. And Ellie, just to give you an example, and why I think some composers fail to acknowledge just how important the contribution of the players is to tell this little story that Lisa was preparing to play the Bird as Prophet, a piece that she's played a couple of times with Ellie. and Ellie was playing for the first time, and at the dress rehearsal, Ellie came out and said to Lisa, I hope you don't mind if I'm not going to use the music. And we were astonished because the music is difficult and very hard, just even with the music. Yeah. And Ellie came out there and played with Lisa in one of the most memorable performances of my life.
Wow. Adding
so much to that piece, bringing so much out of it. Ellie, in a sense, became the violin at that part.
Wow.
And, Lisa's always done that with the piano. So here's a shout out to all the wonderful performers who are never paid enough to do what they do with new music. There's not enough money in the world to compensate them for the hours and the time that they put in when they really believe in what they're doing. Yeah. And those kinds of musical experiences for me make all the failures and the things that don't work out and the bad reviews and all worthwhile.
Well, Dr. Bresnick, an absolute honor to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time. It was great, and I hope to have you back and your wife maybe together at some point to talk more about music. That would be great.
Well, thanks, Tigran. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.